Should I introduce you? Дорогие друзья, dear guests, this is the first actual presentation of our guests from the University of Exeter, who kindly came here to share their knowledge with us on different ways to use digital methods for the humanities research. And we welcome now Dr. Charlotte Tapman, who is going to talk about the potential of linked open data in the research of texts and ancient texts, right? So, welcome, Charlotte.
Thank you very much, and it's lovely to be here. I'm going to use the microphone as I don't project probably to the back of the room otherwise. Yes, I'm going to talk today a little bit about my own research in digital epigraphy, and then I want to bring in the subject of linked open data and how that might benefit the field. So I'm going to give you an introduction to text encoding for ancient materials to start with. I'm going to talk a little bit about where that's got us to, perhaps over the last 5-10 years. And then where we might want to go in bringing out some of the relationships that exist between our texts and other related materials. And then I want to talk a little bit about how we might go about that. One of the things that I have been working on for quite a long time now is EpiDoc. Stands for Epigraphic Documents in TEI XML. And it is essentially a community of scholars who got together to work out how best we might encode our texts in TEI XML, with which I'm sure you're all familiar. It started off as EpiDoc is the brainchild of this man here, Tom Elliott, who first saw the potential of using XML as applied to ancient boundary markers, in fact, for his PhD, and he's really the person who kicked off the EpiDoc initiative. EpiDoc produces a set of guidelines, a bit like the TEI guidelines, but specifically for encoding ancient inscriptions and papyri. And we make these freely available online as sort of teaching materials and as learning materials for anybody who wants to get involved in doing this. It also has a set of related tools as well. If you go to the EpiDoc homepage, you'll find that there are tools for publishing your texts once you've encoded them as well. There's a new tool called EFS, which is epigraphic. All of the EpiDoc elements and attributes and values are drawn from the TEI, but we produce a specific set of guidelines for people who work in this area. So for those of you who are not epigraphers, is there anyone here who's not an epigrapher? All right. I'm going to talk a little bit about what epigraphers record, because this isn't always immediately obvious to everybody. So our primary interest is in inscribed objects which are on durable materials that might be stone, metal, pot, tile, and so forth. And one of the key things that we're interested in recording digitally is the editorial interventions that we make into a text. So a lot of the inscriptions that I work on are from the Roman period, and these are very highly abbreviated. So it becomes like a little bit of a sort of detective puzzle to work out what's actually being put across on the stone, because they're extremely highly abbreviated and the same letter can stand for lots of different things. So we have to use contextual knowledge in order to expand them. So when we produce an edition of an inscribed text, we need to be able to record the editor's expansion of abbreviations. That's quite an important part. But also we need to be able to include things like supplied text. A lot of inscriptions are very damaged, very fragmentary, and we must be prepared to supply different potential interpretations. We also have a lot of people who might disagree about a reading of the text, and particularly about the supplied text that we're going. One of the other things that we need to record as epigraphers is the entities that we're interested in within the stone. So things like people and places and dates and events. And obviously this is information that's common to most of the texts that we work on as humanities scholars. But it's particularly important for us as epigraphers to, for instance, be able... Oh, is that okay? Can everybody hear me? Yeah? Okay, great. Thank you. It's particularly important for us as epigraphers to be able to find stones which, for instance, mention the same people, or stones which would originally have come from the same place, but which have now been moved to other locations. A lot of inscriptions into private collections or moved from one site to another, so we have to kind of reconstruct the life cycle of the inscription. And of course, we would normally provide a translation as well, and a commentary, scholarly commentary, which would give you the historical context and include the bibliography. So these are the kinds of things that we need to be able to encode in Epidoc. And so we've provided essentially all of the elements you need from the TEI to do that. The traditional conventions for publishing epigraphic texts, I'll give you some of them here. So you'll see there's a series of brackets and underdots and square brackets and angle brackets and so forth. These are the traditional sigla that are used to indicate the editorial interventions in the text that I've just been talking about. And so what Epidoc has done is it's basically said we need to have this as a basic feature of our encoding. We need to have the equivalents to the Leiden conventions as a basis, and then we can expand on that and actually provide more than the Leiden conventions can do. Now I don't know how clearly you can see this from here, but this is from what we call our Epidoc cheat sheet, which we use in workshops, and we give them out as handouts. Perhaps I should prepare some of that. You can see that we've got the description of the interventions on the left-hand side, and then we've got four columns here showing how those are represented in different publications, and you can see that epigraphers and papyrologists haven't always agreed on which brackets to use for what, which can be a bit problematic, as you can imagine, because you go from one publication to another, not being quite sure whether somebody means the same thing by the brackets or the other dots that they've used. On the right-hand side, you can see the Epidoc version, so that's the TEI XML version, and here you can see that there is no room for ambiguity here. You can see precisely what's meant. So you have, for instance, a deletion, rend equals erasure, so that's where there's been a deliberate act of erasing some text on the stone, for instance. And of course, by using TEI, you can choose how to output that. So that's our underlying encoding, but we can choose when we want to use one of the styles from the main epigraphic publications and papyrological publications, or whether we want to represent it in some other way. So we have a sort of two-step process. So why do we use shared standards? I guess most people in the room are probably already sold on this, but I'm just going to go through a couple of things. Obviously, using shared standards such as Epidoc helps us to avoid the effect of the digital silo, which I'm sure you've all come across, the idea that people create their own digital projects in their own way, but then they can't get their data to talk to one another. There's no means of getting from one to the other. I would venture that using shared standards also increases the chance that your data will be sustainable in the longer term. Of course, we can never promise any of that. We've been talking earlier today about what happens when you come to the end of a project, how it's archived, how the data continues after the end of that project. But I think if you're using shared standards, then more people are likely to have an investment in your data. I think that's for sure. I'd also say that using shared standards encourages people to make new use of what we produce as well. If we're making our Epidoc files available for other people to use after the end of our own project, then we're opening it up to the possibility that other people will add their own encoding or do things with our text that we perhaps ourselves haven't yet imagined. In the early days of working on this and trying to persuade epigraphers to think about the possibility of learning some XML, we encountered a certain amount of resistance from people who felt that perhaps they didn't want to learn this, or they've been in the game too long to learn new things. So I tend to use this lady, Joyce Reynolds, as an example of why that's not a good excuse. This was Joyce 10 years ago, when she was 90, and I went on a research trip with her in Libya. She's just celebrated her 100th birthday, and she's one of the foremost people who actually have supported Epidoc and have published using it. So she is a very eminent epigrapher and has worked for many, many years on the inscriptions of North Africa in particular. Oh, yeah, and the reason she's not in that photograph, this is halfway up a mountain doing some work on a rock-cut tomb, and the reason she's not there is she's actually further up the mountain, working on a different tomb inscription. So, one of the very earliest Epidoc projects was the inscriptions of Aphrodisias. This is a site in southwest Turkey. And the reason I'm showing you this is that although by today's standards of digital publications this looks quite old and in need of updating, the key thing about this for us was that not only could we use it to create different pathways through our texts, so we can start to investigate inscriptions by their text categories or the type of monument, the date, the types of decorative features that exist on the monuments, which are really important for us as epigraphers. As well as that, which by the way, is particularly useful because the traditional print publications are extremely hard to mine for this kind of data. It's very, very difficult. If you're interested in 3rd century marble funerary altars, for instance, actually to find those unless you have a digital publication of this kind. So as well as that, I think probably the most important thing to come out of this project was this, which is kind of hidden away and looks rather uninteresting, but it just says XML repository. But this is where we enabled people to download the Epidoc files. And this actually led a lot of people to start using these files as examples. When they were learning how to do encoding, they could actually download the full set of these files and actually learn from them and use them in their own work if they wanted to do so. Nowadays, of course, things are very different. We have many hundreds of thousands of texts published in Epidoc. This includes some of the major databases. So this is the database at Heidelberg. When I took the screenshot, it had 77,498 inscriptions published in Epidoc. And it uses the encoding to produce this kind of this advanced search. So you can search by these. This is basically the simple list, and each of these you can expand. And I'm not going to do that now, but you can have a look if you're interested in doing so. I've talked all about the people view because that's the thing I'm most interested in, but I should bring some papyrology into this. Another very major open project was papyri.info, and that actually aggregated several of the major papyrological databases for the first time. So previously you had to go to each of the databases and do your searching and do your research in each of the websites that they produced. Papyri.info now has a federated search, which not only allows you to search for what you're looking for, but also it provides an editorial interface, which means that you can contribute your own text to the papyrological database. This is done, you can either do this using your own epidoc XML file, or you can write in something that looks a little bit more like the Leiden conventions that I showed you, but is actually sort of stealthily writing XML underneath, which is something that quite a lot of papyrologists have reacted well to, because basically they're writing what they expect to see, but it's actually producing XML underneath, and they can then submit this to the database, where it's then reviewed by an editorial board. And obviously, that can be quite a lot of work. I mean, projects like this tend to rely on people being willing to give their time to be reviewers, to be on editorial boards, and actually check everybody's text. So you can either get your text back saying, fantastic, we agree with everything you've done, and we're going to include your text in the database, or you can get an email back saying, actually we think you've done something wrong on line 3, maybe you'd like to reconsider this, or of course there's the awful possibility that the editorial board might write back and say, we reject your text utterly, we think it's terrible. So hopefully that won't happen. But I wanted to show you this as an example of a project that's actually inviting contributions directly and making sure that people get credit for that. And actually, we've used this quite successfully in sessions with students who are learning how to do some encoding and who are papyrologists, that's their background, and it means that they can actually contribute to a live project and include that in their publications. So where has encoding our texts over the last few years actually got us to? Well, it's certainly enabled us to capture and make available the semantic distinctions in our texts. We've been able to encode something about the meaning of what's going on in our texts through using this encoding. It's allowed us to produce machine-readable and machine-processable text and data about the materials that we're working on. It's certainly provided in this field the basis for developing federated searches across different types of text which are related to one another. But I also think it's made the editorial process much more explicit. And in fact, I was running a workshop a few weeks ago, and a colleague who was learning TEI for the first time said, but there's nowhere for me to hide. And then he stopped and said, oh, but that's a good thing. In other words, as an editor, he wanted to be challenged to be explicit about his editorial process. And I think the process of marking up a text can sometimes make us think differently about the text and can also make us question our own editorial process. And as I said before, I think encoding our text has offered us some opportunities for further research based on what we've encoded, and I'll talk a little bit about that later on. Okay, but is all this enough? This is what we've been encouraging people to do for the last 5-10 years. It's worked very successfully, I think, but where can we go from here? Well, we know that text encoding is good for recording semantic information about our texts, but it's not quite so good at describing those relationships that exist between our texts and between the text that we study and other materials that might actually have related information to do with our text or to do with the subjects of our research. And that's why I want to talk a little bit about linked open data now. because it's one method for allowing us to describe and record the connections, the nature of the connections that exist in our research and between our texts in a way that's machine readable. Of course, it's also human readable, but not many people like reading RDF for fun, so I'm going to concentrate mainly on the machine readable part of that. I might be talking to a room of people who already know what linked open data is, so I'm not sure whether does anybody not know much about linked open data? Does anybody want me to talk about what it is? Everybody knows about linked open data. No? No? Okay. I can tell you. Okay. Fair enough. So, this, you might recognise him. This is Tim Berners-Lee. And he produced a series, you can get it on a nice mug here, he produced a series of 5 steps to producing linked open data. So it's a kind of 5-star system. Firstly, you need to produce your data using an open license. So you need to publish using an open license so that anybody can see it, anyone can store it for themselves and do other things with it. That's the fundamental principle of linked open data. He then suggested that for 2-star linked open data, it needed to be machine readable and also structured in some way. It could still be locked into proprietary software, though, for 2-star linked open data. So you might need to spend money on the program to be able to open it and use it. For 3-star linked open data, he said basically we should use a non-proprietary format. So something like CSV files or one of the other formats that doesn't require us to have special software to use it. For 4-star linked open data, he suggested that we use URIs, unique resource identifiers, or uniform resource identifiers, to identify the entities within our text. So essentially there's a unique reference for each of the entities that we're interested in. And then for 5-star linked open data, the idea is that you then link the data you've produced to data that other people have produced in order to produce context for what you're doing and in order to allow people to explore different pathways through the data that's out there. Those are the main principles of linked open data. This is a nice illustration produced a few years ago of the concept of linked data sets, the idea being that each of these represents a different data set and there are connections that exist between them. I don't know if you've seen the Europeana explanation of linked open data. It does sound a little bit like an advert, but I'm going to play it anyway because it might be useful for those people who are not so familiar. Okay. It starts off with a dramatic timpani roll, so hopefully that won't be too loud.
Linked open data. What is it? And why is it good for you as a memory organisation? Put yourself in your user's shoes. Say you want to find out about that painting of Venus standing on a shell. You'd probably search on the word Venus. You'll get lots of results. Venus, Venus, Venus. And after a while, you finally reach the right Venus on an individual website. But what if the web service could help you from the start? First, by disambiguating your search, and then by connecting all kinds of relevant information, updated dynamically, within the same web space. Well, linked open data makes this possible. Here's how. Tim Berners-Lee, the inventor of the World Wide Web, asked us to put our information as documents on the web, and so we did. Lots of information today is available on lots of individual websites. And then he saw the next step forward. He asked us to put our information on the web as raw data, because raw data can be linked to other data. That generates connections for the user, and puts them in touch with a much richer network of information. But to make that happen, you've got to do 4 things. First, it helps if your data is openly licensed. If it's not open, it's not easily interoperable. Second, you need to put your data on the web in a certain way, so that the connecting links are present in their simplest form. And each of these links is represented using the Resource Description Framework, or RDF triple, because it's in 3 parts. And all these triples will interconnect. Third, when they are online, they need a unique address, a uniform resource identifier. Fourth, you need to put them online following the standard Web Resource Protocol, HTTP. And hey presto, your linked open data can be connected to all other linked open data, creating a rich network of information, making connections you never knew were there, linking knowledge in a way that's never been done before.
I'll stop it there. But hopefully that gives you an idea. So why might we specifically want to use linked open data? Well, certainly as ancient historians and of course as historians more generally, we have a huge range of different kinds of sources that have lots of different sorts of connections that exist between our documents, whether that's places, people, events, and so on. And linked open data can help to make these shared connections discoverable in a way that hasn't, I think it's fair to say, previously been possible. We actually already have a large amount of historical data that's available openly online to experiment with and to use for this kind of research. So that's another plus point as to why we might want to experiment with this now. It enables serendipitous discovery, which I think is pretty important. I mean, if I go to, let's say, a database of inscriptions around, a database of funerary altars, I'll come back to that example, then I might be interested in other kinds of materials that use the same decorative elements and the same symbolic features, but which are not on inscriptions, but are on different types of materials. And the possibility of finding those is greatly increased by using these kinds of methods. I think it can also help us to identify relevant connections that exist outside our own specialisms, which is something that I think people are increasingly interested in doing if they want to do collaborative research and they want to do interdisciplinary research. This is the reaction that you tend to get, though. So how do we stand up to that? Well, one of the things that we can do is to provide tools which enable people to create linked open data a bit more easily. We're certainly in a situation where most people don't necessarily want to write linked open data from scratch. It's something that I know, like some people definitely would want to do that, but quite a lot of people want a sort of user-friendly tool to help them do that. And tomorrow I'm going to talk in more detail about the Requisito tool from the Pelagios project. I'll just give a very brief example here, and then we can talk about it quite a lot more tomorrow. So this is basically giving you a chance to do semantic annotation without the pointy brackets, so without having to learn to code. And of course, part of me thoroughly disapproves of that because I think it's a really good idea to give people a chance to learn the code. But on the other hand, this is actually going to be drawing in people who just don't have an interest in learning the coding, but who actually have an interest in research interest in creating linked open data for their own purposes. So you can look at it both ways, but I have to say that I think this tool works really, really well. It's now hosted, it's now part of the research projects that we have at the University of Exeter. It's run by Professor Leif Isaacson, whom I know some of you know, and he has been working for many years on the Pelagios project. It's in I think its 7th phase of funding now, and it's funded by the Mellon Foundation, and it's developed over the years from being a very sort of ancient world-based, classical-based project to a much wider project with with tools for people to use who are working on pretty much any time periods. Okay. Yeah, I had to have a shot of the Digital Humanities Lab here. And some of the projects that we were talking about earlier, you'll recognise some of those. As I say, Leif joined us a couple of years ago, so this is the latest phase of the Pelagos project. He's now based partly at Exeter, and the object of it is to give you tools to create it and explore it, and also to be able to join a community of scholars who are actually working on creating link-open data in different fields. I'm going to look just very briefly at the first option, creating linked data with Recogito. Essentially, it provides you with an interface that does sort of auto-annotation, in this case of places. So what the tool does is it goes through your text. You can just essentially cut and paste a text into the interface, and you then ask it to auto-identify the places in the text. And you then have the option, obviously, of saying, yes, I agree with the annotation, or no, I don't agree with the annotation. You can see here there's this little pop-up box that comes up, and it tells you what it thinks you've identified in your text, and you can confirm it. You can also add your own comments and add tags. Whilst this was written initially for place data, you can also have person data and event data as well now. And as I say, we'll talk more about that tomorrow. I should say, not only can you annotate text, you can also annotate images. So this is a 15th century atlas, and you can see it's the same principle. You can see this, but basically each of these little boxes here is an annotation on a map, and then you can geolocate each of the places in the image. And then from that, the tool will produce a map of all the places that you've geolocated. So you can see quite clearly here all the places that are mentioned on the atlas. And the different colour coding there is by the folio of the manuscript. So that's what we've just encoded. So we're using here a thing called a plugins identifier. So this is a unique resource identifier which relates specifically to that particular place within the ancient world gazetteer of plugins. But for the modern locations, we can use geonames, which I think you've probably come across. It's a gazetteer in modern places. The need to do this was predicted quite a while ago. Probably before this article came out, but I'm going to mention it anyway because it was published in 2009, having been written in 2007, and it was called Epigraphy in 2017. So this is a set of scholars who were trying to imagine what epigraphy would look like for us, of course now 2 years ago. And they identified the need for persistent identifiers, unique identifiers, to allow us to identify the entities in our text and be able to link them together. I mentioned the Hyades Gazetteer. This is basically the ancient world gazetteer. It's based on the Barrington Atlas of the Greek and Roman world originally, and it's now expanded greatly into other periods. So this is the ancient world gazetteer that we use, and then we use geonames, as I say, for modern places. People are now producing gazetteers of all sorts of things. This is a gazetteer of Roman roads, so that rather than referring to a place, if you want to refer to a road or a way, then you can do that. There are also gazetteers of time periods, which is quite useful because we all have different ways of referring to different time periods, and it can be quite useful to have something to point to that says we mean this specific time period, whatever it may be called. So it's all about disambiguation, essentially. If you go to the Pleiades page for this site, which is provincial capital of Lusitania, you can see the canonical URI for this page. So every single page within the site, every single place has this canonical URI, and using this number will allow you to point directly to that place. And this shows you, the names by which the place has been known over time. And if you scroll down the page, you can see related content from Pelagius, and this is where the linked open data bit comes in. Because if I'm interested in Merida, I'm interested in what happened at that site and the kinds of materials that are from that site, I can come here and I can see that we have 198 inscriptions from another ethnographic database. We also have quite a lot of numismatic databases which have points from that area. So you can kind of see that this technique becomes more useful the more people who are actually producing it, because then you have the greater number of links and the greater connections. Okay, so I made that a bit easier to read. So just coming back in, just briefly to why this is useful for people who study inscriptions, which is where I started off. It's because we have a huge amount of things like place data and person data in our materials. So for place data, we have things like where the stone was found. We have where it was originally located, which might be different from the find spot. We have its current location. As I say, a lot of the inscriptions are moved over time, and it's extremely important for us to know where they've been and where they are now. But also we have a lot of places that are mentioned in the text itself, and these are often places which are known by different names over time. These are places that may have the same name as another place. It's quite important for us to be able to use some method of disambiguating and pointing our users to the correct place. For person data, we talked a lot about place, but if we just briefly talk about people, we've got people who are commemorated in the text. A lot of the material I work on also includes the names of people who are actually doing the commemorating of somebody else. So I'm interested in who they were and what relationships they had with one another. We also have information on the people who are responsible for discovering the inscription. We have current editors, and we have previous editors, and that's really important too, because we have, as I say, all these different readings of the text that we have to record. And there's actually a project called Standards for Networking Ancient Prosopographies, or SNAP, which attempts to assign a unique identifier to each of the people, basically to everybody in the ancient world. That sounds incredibly ambitious, and it is. But it's a bit like the Gazetteer projects assigning URIs. There seems no reason to me why we can't do something similar to for people. Although it would obviously be a huge undertaking until we've just begun. Of course, we have the interesting thing of what do we do with mythological people, what do we do with fictional people as well. I guess they need identifiers too. The idea behind this then is that we end up with a sort of a network, a linked pasts network, in which all these different databases which exist in their own right are actually able to talk to one another and to exchange data. And as a researcher, you can come to this and search across these databases and follow paths to the data that you couldn't find before. There are people who are actually studying where we've got to with this. Sarah Middle's work, the Open University, is very interesting, and anyone who's interested in this, I'd recommend going and having a look at what she's doing. Okay, so once you've created your linked data using the tools I've just mentioned, this is pretty important stuff. So you can download your data to use, and you can download it in a variety of formats. So for annotations that you're making, these are the assertions that you're making about there being a connection between one thing and another. You can download that as CSV or RDF. You can also download it on place data with GeoJSON and KML, and so this tool provides you with that. So essentially what you're doing by doing the annotation within the Recogito tool is that you're producing all of these outputs. And that means that when it comes to something like the database I mentioned earlier, we can actually download all 77,000 inscriptions, and then we can get together and decide how to use that and what's interesting about that. So a couple of years ago we had a session to do exactly that. The database that I just showed you was at the time in need of more funding, and there were some concerns about whether it was going to be able to continue. And the fact that they produced their data in a way that was usable for us was really important, as it meant that we could actually continue doing research on that. Even if the front end were to fall over, even if we no longer had the website up and running, we had the data, and so then we can run our own searches on it. We could actually do something with that data. So if you're interested in creating linked open data, where can you do that? Where can you get help to create it and use it? Well, there's a very active and also very friendly community of people who are creating this. So there's every year there's a Linked Pass conference which you can attend, and there's also a set of working groups and mailing lists for people who are interested in producing linked open data of a particular type. So perhaps they might be producing data on monuments within a city, for instance. So having identifiers for specific monuments, not only for cities or settlements, but also for places within those cities. There are actually grants that are available to do work. Every year, the Pelagios project actually has a series of small grants for people who want to do exploratory linked open data projects, and you can apply for money and actually be supported in creating that data, and that's been very successful so far, so look out for the call. And just to finish up, I would say the community, as I say, is extremely supportive and helpful, and so anybody who's thinking of participating, I would say jump in and have a go. Okay, thanks very much.
I guess we have plenty of questions, right? So, questions? Frank?
1, 2, 3. Okay. Thanks for this great talk. I especially love to hear about linked open data because I don't think I'm going out on a limb here when I say that it's not really a topic within our center. In regard to drama, European drama, we work with this. I will also mention something about this tomorrow. And the question that I would have would be, which role does Wikidata play in your projects? Because I think it's like the up-and-coming thing, which has advantages, but also maybe has disadvantages. For us, it's really something that's the easiest way to connect a corpus or entities of the corpus to the linked open data cloud at large, because it's just so easy to use. So that would be my question.
Yeah, I think it's good to use it. I think the more people who do use it, probably the more useful and effective it becomes, as with any of these things. I certainly wouldn't say that it's a bad idea to use Wikidata. I mean, the examples I draw on are all from elsewhere, simply because these are the specific things that are to do with my own subject area. But certainly, I think Wikidata is really important for helping people to connect easily into that cloud.
But are you actively adding to it, or are you actively adding to it, or is this really something that's just on your radar, but it's not really purposeful for your projects?
So, for me personally, I haven't contributed to it, but I suspect very strongly that I will be doing it in future. Certainly, some of my colleagues who are working on some of the projects that I mentioned briefly are using it. So, yeah, it's just that I personally am. I'm not at the moment. Yeah.
Other questions? Yeah, I have one when everybody else is thinking of their questions. It kind of follows on what Frank says. No, like a few years ago when I was reading up on like linked open data and semantic web especially, like and what Timothy Berners-Lee actually conjured up with, I thought that industry kind of decided it to be at a dead end. Like none of the like search engines didn't seem to be caring about like linked open data, and they used to find other ways, like ways more concerned with like machine learning and building clever algorithms and parsers rather than actually trying to move people towards encoding their data in a smart way. So they chose to deal with the raw data they usually face. And I thought, well, probably the idea just didn't kick off. But then recently I heard of this project done together with it's a joint project of Metropolitan Museum in New York and Google, and they actually seem to be using some sort of linked open data, some sort of smart, sophisticated data objects which describe works of art, and they integrate them into the Google Knowledge Graph so that it could emerge in the search. So it seems that some industry giants, at least, are turning their face again to the structured domain. So do you think this could also have some, I don't know, some reach, this could somehow reach out to wider audience through like integrating this sort of knowledge into some sort of search engines, maybe not Google, but yeah.
Yes, absolutely. I think that probably one of the best examples of the use of linked open data is actually cultural heritage organisations like museums, archives, libraries, who are actually using this already to connect their catalogues together. I think the point about it being used more widely in industry and the fact that there's interest in that is really important. Actually, you kind of feel like it ought not to be, because you're wanting to use this for scholarly purposes. And it kind of shouldn't make any difference. But the truth is, it does make a difference, because XML, for instance, if that wasn't used outside academia, it wouldn't be as well supported, I think. We wouldn't have the kind of tools to work with it that we do, and I think it's very, very helpful for any of the technologies that we use to be more widely applicable. And certainly, I think for linked open data, that's probably particularly the case because it's been quite hard until tools like Pelagius, which actually I just realised I ought to say this if on Lee's behalf, if not for anything else. Pelagius has just won the DH Awards this year for the best suite of DH tools. So I should probably have said that earlier. Sorry. So I think creating tools like this is really useful for our purposes, but it's also important to have wider backing if that's possible. And I think probably the reason why people haven't got into linked open data earlier is because it hasn't been very easy to create. And you've had things like the Sparkle endpoint to query it, and people don't like that, and it's very difficult. And so I think yeah, that support's really, really important. Yeah.
Sure, other questions? If you want to ask a question in Russian, I can translate actually. So you can use it separately. Yeah.
I don't wanna, if somebody else has a question, please go first. First, I might add to that. I mean, Pelagius and Recognito already is successful. I heard that also Recognito got a DARIA grant for sustainability, so it's all well deserved, I think. I have a question about the Epidoc scenery community. I'm not really part of it. Coming back to your question, if anybody here is not an epigrapher, that's me. I'm that person. Although I did transcribe epigraphs at some point, but I wouldn't call myself that. But my question would be, how much time do we put into the output of the? I mean, how to make the TI look nice? Because in our perspective, we love to have TI because we can base really good research on it, and then usually people ask us, why does your output documents look so ugly? Because we don't invest time in that. Although we would like to make it look nice, but that's not the first thing you do. So my question would be, what's your experience based on making things look nice? I mean, how much effort do you put into that?
It's kind of annoying, isn't it, that needs to be a big factor, but it is. People do like things that look nice and that are easy to use. And so we're forced into a situation where we must think about that a lot. And my own experience of that has really been in the context of specific funded projects, which have tended to develop tools for, as you say, making the XML look nice. So we've developed a series of styles and a series of style sheets, and in fact the Epidom community makes all those style sheets available. So you can download the XSLT for converting your XML into HTML for display on the web, and you can choose different styles depending on whether you like the what we call the London style, or the Cromwell Pancheri style, or the data management documentary papyri style, and so on. And of course, once you've got those style sheets there, you can then modify them to your own purposes. So you're not obliged to use them, but you can use them as the basis for what you do. I don't work a huge amount on the front end, so I'm not a user interface specialist or anything like that. So I'd say that I personally haven't done a huge amount of work in that area, but I have obviously been involved in projects where we've been working on the interface and how people access the text easily. I mean, the Epidoc front-end services, which I mentioned earlier, this is essentially a method for reasonably easy publication of your text once you've put them into Epidoc, has these style sheets integrated into that, so you can always start there and then modify them. Yeah.
Sure, other questions? So if no, let's just wait 1, 2, 3. If no questions, then I guess let's give another round of applause to our speaker, Mr. Charl. And now we can have like 10 minutes break, I guess, before we welcome our second speaker, Dr. Richard Ward. And yeah, everybody else can have tea or coffee back there.